Alcohol and caffeine can impact our sleep in some surprising ways. Let's take caffeine to begin with. Caffeine is a stimulant, and we all know that caffeine alerts us and makes us feel more awake. It's in a class of drugs that we actually call the psychoactive stimulants. But even though we all know that caffeine wakes us up and makes us more alert, there are at least two other features of caffeine that you may be less familiar with. The first of those is the timing of caffeine, and specifically its duration of action. Caffeine has a half-life of about 5 to 6 hours for the average adult. What that means is that about 50% of that caffeine is still circulating in your system 5 to 6 hours after you had that cup of coffee. What that also means, however, is that caffeine has a quarter life of somewhere between 10 to 12 hours. So in other words, if you have a cup of coffee at, let's say, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, a quarter of that caffeine can still be circulating in your brain at midnight. So having a cup of coffee in the afternoon may be the equivalent of tucking yourself into bed at midnight, and just before you do, you swig a quarter of a cup of coffee and you hope for a good night of sleep. And that's unlikely to happen for some of us. The second hidden feature of caffeine is its disruption in terms of our sleep quality. Now, some people will tell me, look, I'm one of those individuals, I can have an espresso with dinner and I fall asleep just fine and I stay asleep. I don't have a problem with caffeine. But even if that's true, it turns out that caffeine can decrease the amount of deep sleep that you have, stages 3 and 4 of non-REM sleep. And so as a consequence, you wake up the next morning and you don't feel as restored by your sleep. You don't feel refreshed. But you don't remember struggling to fall asleep, and you don't remember waking up at night, so you don't connect the dots, you don't connect the two. But now you find yourself reaching for maybe 2 or 3 cups of coffee the next morning to feel wide awake because of what we call unrestorative sleep. I should note, by the way, that there's a huge amount of variability in our sensitivity to caffeine. And in fact, we know why, because there are specific enzymes that are determined by specific genes that we know of, which will speed up or slow down the metabolism of caffeine. And that's why some people will say, I am very sensitive to caffeine. I just need 1 cup of caffeine in the morning and that's me. Otherwise, I get the jitters and it's too much. Other people can drink caffeine maybe up to midday and they're just fine. The way in which caffeine works comes back to something we've spoken about previously, which is adenosine and sleep pressure. And so we mentioned that adenosine builds throughout the day, and the more that we're awake, the more adenosine builds up and the sleepier that we feel. Now, you may have noticed that those two words, caffeine and adenosine, sound a little bit similar, and they are similar chemically, but they do very different things. Caffeine will race into your brain and it will latch on to the welcome sites of adenosine, what we call the adenosine receptors in the brain. And when caffeine latches on to those adenosine receptors, it essentially hijacks those receptors and it blocks them. And so as a consequence, caffeine is preventing the signal of adenosine telling your brain that you are sleepy, that you've had all of this sleepiness being built up throughout the day. So think of caffeine as racing into your brain and essentially hitting the mute button on adenosine. And it's fooled your brain into thinking, no, you haven't been awake for 12 hours. You've maybe only been awake for 4 hours or just 5 hours. And so your brain doesn't receive the normal signal of sleepiness anymore. But there's a nasty sting in the tail of this story of caffeine and adenosine. As that caffeine is in your system and blocking the receptors, that adenosine is still building up. So if you're burning the midnight oil, you're trying to write a paper late into the evening or do a work project, and you're sort of drinking those cups of coffee, then once that caffeine starts to become metabolized and is washed out of the system, as it were, not only will you go back to the same level of sleepiness that you were suffering before you had the cup of coffee, you're going to have that plus all of the additional adenosine that has been building up while the caffeine has been in your system. What does this feel like? Well, what it feels like is a caffeine crash, because the caffeine finally washes out of the system and then you're hit with this huge wave of sleepiness. And now you have to have an even stronger cup of coffee to get over that sleepiness signal that has hit you as a consequence. So caffeine, by way of its impairment or its reduction in deep sleep, could have significant implications. We know that it's during deep sleep that we get benefits for the cardiovascular system, and that deep sleep can help prime and recharge our immune system. And also we know that it's during deep sleep that we cement those new facts into the neural architecture of the brain and making them less likely to be forgotten. And so therefore, if we're decreasing the amount of deep sleep that we're getting, we run the risk of not receiving the full benefit from all of the deep sleep that we could naturally be generating, but that we are compromised in because we still have too much caffeine in our system. Caffeine is sometimes found in hidden places. I'm someone who typically doesn't drink caffeine. I'm not simply trying to be the poster child for good sleep. It's just that I'm somewhat sensitive to caffeine. So I drink decaffeinated coffee sometimes in the morning, but I still get an alerting benefit. And that's in part because decaffeinated coffee is not non-caffeinated coffee. Decaffeinated coffee still has caffeine in it. Now, often it's usually very small amounts, maybe somewhere up to 5% of the normal amount of caffeine that's in a standard cup of coffee. But other decaffeinated coffees can actually have more than that. Some have been found to have 20 or 30% of the standard amount of a cup of coffee. So if you have 3 or 4 of those, it's the equivalent of having a full coffee. Many energy drinks out there have caffeine in them. And of course, they're designed to wake you up and keep you alert. Caffeine can also be found in things that we usually have for desserts. For example, ice cream can sometimes have caffeine in if you look on the label. Many of us, as an evening treat, will have a little scoop of ice cream, or we'll have a couple of pieces of dark chocolate. What we may not realize is that those couple of segments of dark chocolate can have almost as much caffeine as a cup of coffee. If you are finding yourself to be struggling with sleep at night, having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep, be mindful of your caffeine intake throughout the day, but also just be mindful of the other foods that you're eating. Do an experiment. For the next 3 days, when you're eating and drinking the typical things that you do, try to, as a homework assignment, just turn over the packet and see if you can look to see if it says caffeine. Or just do a little bit of research and find out if some of those foods have caffeine in them. And that will help you best moderate. Many of us, of course, like to have just perhaps one nightcap in the evening, just one little tipple of maybe a whiskey or a glass of wine. How bad is one glass or one serving of alcohol? Well, I would love to say that it doesn't have an impact, but there are scientific studies demonstrating that even one glass of alcohol in the evening will end up resulting in measurable changes in your sleep. Alcohol is perhaps the most misunderstood sleep aid that there is out there. In fact, alcohol is not helpful for our sleep. It's actually quite harmful for our sleep. First, alcohol is in a class of drugs that we call the sedatives. And sedation is not sleep. But when you have a couple of drinks in the evening, you mistake the former for the latter. You think that you are falling asleep quicker, but really what you're doing is just simply drifting into a light sedation more quickly. You're not going into naturalistic sleep. Indeed, if I were to show you the patterns of your electrical brain activity when you have normal natural sleep versus your sleep when you've had some alcohol, a couple of drinks in the evening, you would see that they're different. It's not the same electrical natural pattern of brain activity. The second problem with alcohol is that it will disrupt your sleep and you will wake up many more times throughout the night. It's what we call sleep fragmentation, and it leads to poor quality of sleep. Now, the issue here is that these awakenings that alcohol will trigger are often very brief, and so you don't commit them to memory. So you wake up the next day and you don't feel great, you don't feel particularly restored, you don't feel very alert, but you don't remember waking up as many times as you did throughout the night, triggered by the alcohol. And the way that this works is that alcohol at night can actually shift you over into a more activated state of the nervous system in the body, called the fight or flight branch of the nervous system. And alcohol can also trigger stimulating neurochemicals in the brain. And those things will more likely trigger these awakenings throughout the night. And that's why your sleep becomes fragmented. The third problem with alcohol is that it will disrupt your REM sleep. We know that REM sleep is critical for lots of different functions, things such as your mental and your emotional health, such as creativity. REM sleep and the duration of your REM sleep has even been associated with duration of your lifespan. Those people who have more REM sleep, on average, typically live longer. Science has some evidence that really speaks to the impact of particularly alcohol on the disruption of REM sleep. And in one study, they took a group of adults and they taught them a learning and memory task where they had to integrate and connect information together. And then 7 days later, they tested them to see how much of that information they had retained. Now, one group learned on the first day, and then they were tested out on day 7. And they had 6 nights of intervening natural sleep. A second group did exactly the same thing. They learned without any alcohol in their system, and then they were tested out on day 7 without any alcohol. But just before they went to bed on the first night after learning, they got them a little bit drunk. They gave them a couple of shots of vodka. And then they tested them 1 week later. And then they took a third group and they did exactly the same thing. But now, instead of giving them alcohol the first night after learning, they gave them alcohol on the third night after learning. What they found was stunning. Relative to the group that was getting natural sleep across that 1 week, those individuals who had their sleep dosed with alcohol and as a consequence had their REM sleep disrupted, either on the first night after learning or even on the third night after learning, they lost anywhere between 30 to 50% of the information that they'd originally learned. And that tells us how critical sleep after learning is for connecting and holding on to these memories. And that after the first night of sleep, your brain is not finished with that information processing. It still needs subsequent nights of sleep and good, healthy quality of sleep to lock those memories into place. Sometimes people will tell me, I don't quite understand it. At the weekend, I'll have a couple of drinks in the evening. Maybe I sleep in a little bit late, but I end up having these really strange, bizarre, odd dreams. They're really intense. Why is that? Well, it turns out that your brain is actually quite smart, and it understands how much REM sleep it should normally be getting. Now, when you have a couple of drinks in the evening, the brain, as we've mentioned, will be deprived and starved of that REM sleep. But if you've had perhaps alcohol where finally in the late morning hours, your liver and your kidneys are starting to get rid of that alcohol, in those late morning hours, not only do you go on to get the REM sleep that you normally would have had, but your brain tries to get back some of the REM sleep that it's been missing because of the blockade of REM sleep by way of alcohol. And it's what we call a REM sleep rebound effect. You can't get back all of the REM sleep that you lost. The brain is keeping a clock counter of how much REM sleep it should have had, how much REM sleep it has not had, and how much REM sleep it still needs to try and get. Even though it has that system, it's never capable of regaining back all of the lost REM sleep. So you will remain REM sleep deficient as a consequence. I think the best piece of advice is try to limit caffeine in the afternoon and in the evenings. Try to stay away from caffeine once midday has happened, or certainly try to stay away from caffeine after 2 p.m. Now, I'm not suggesting here that you need to stay away from caffeine entirely. Caffeine does have some health benefits, but here it's not just the dose that makes the poison. It's the dose and the timing that makes the poison. Try to limit yourself to just a couple of cups of coffee during the morning hours, and then try to cut yourself off in the afternoon. If you end up having a couple of drinks at night, it's still good to maintain your good sleep habits, and that includes regularity. So still trying to wake up at the same time of day that you normally would, even if it's the weekend. Regularity is one of the best weapons that we have in the toolbox of better sleep, because regularity helps keep you on that standard 24-hour cycle, that rhythmic behavior. So waking up at the same time, going to bed at the same time, no matter what day of the week or the weekend it is, that will actually help regularize both your circadian rhythm, but also help with managing the different stages of sleep, so that your brain is never in this state of getting dragged forward or back in time at the weekend. And when you get that consistency within brain and the body can better manage the sleep quantity of both non-REM and REM sleep. I just want to sort of offer a note of kindness here. I don't want to be puritanical about these things. What I'm trying to offer is the information and the science about sleep in relation to alcohol and caffeine. And so that you, the individual, you can make an informed choice as to how best you would like to live your life when it comes to prioritizing your sleep health.